Good morning. Oh, good afternoon. I'm so used to saying good morning standing in this room. Thank you all for coming. I'm Malloy, and I teach in the C semester program here at the C Education Association. And I am lucky enough that my association with SEA has allowed me to sail to some very exotic places, including in the Pacific Ocean. I've actually been on the Robert C. Seamans along the coast of Alaska and British Columbia, and also down in the South Seas, in French Polynesia, in Kiribati, and Hawaii. And so a lot of the things that we have been thinking about for this class are things that I had studied for 20 years before, but a lot of them really came together as a result of working at SEA. So today I'm going to talk about collections made by American mariners, mostly in the late 18th and early 19th century, in islands of Polynesia and along the northwest coast. And the thing that is really the most important thing about this is that these places were really just becoming known to Europeans and Americans in the late 18th century. Captain Cook, when he made his first voyage out to the South Pacific, published a narrative which was widely read. And so all these guys on these ships have copies of these narratives that have been written by the earlier mariners. But they're interested in the local people in various places to which they travel. And this was an age also when museums were being founded. And so there were actually institutions in Massachusetts that were open and ready to receive artifacts that came back when the voyages were still being made. So the Massachusetts Historical Society was founded in 1790, the East India Marine Society in Salem in 1799. So these were places that were interested in the artifacts even as they came back. And so we have a way of documenting them by looking at documents of the voyages on which they were collected, which I'm sorry to say is not as much as one would hope. These guys came back. We know that this big ceramic horse came back from China on a particular voyage in the 1790s to Salem. And there's a logbook of that voyage. They don't say a single thing about it. I mean, you would think that when this horse comes out, somebody would say, cool horse, but nobody said anything about it. So a lot of times, even with good documents of the voyages, we can't find out any more about them. But the thing that is the most sort of affecting about all of this is that diseases brought by Europeans and Americans into these places at that time led to a real collapse of the populations, to the extent that in some places, within 30 years of the first contact, 90% of the population had died. So we're looking at a tremendous loss of not only populations, but also of cultural information. And then the thing that happened right after that is that missionaries began to arrive in the next wave of ships, and people who were devastated by population loss were actually ripe for conversion. So there was a rapid conversion to Christianity, and so a lot of the cultural information that had been available in the late 19th century was no longer there by the late in the late 18th century, was no longer there by the late 19th century. So that the artifacts that were collected by Europeans and Americans and brought back to museums are some of the few things that survive from that period. And in some places, the Marquesas, for instance, I'm going to talk about this again a little bit later, but today there are no old pieces that survive at all in the Marquesas. So young carvers who are interested in recreating some of the traditional kinds of carving have no examples to look at. And that's a really hard thing. So that's one of the sort of issues you go up at the end. It seems like I've already started, but I haven't, because before I start, I have an errata from last a month ago, if you were here. I actually talked about this painting. I didn't show a picture of it, and I said that it was by Whistler. And in fact, afterwards, Judy Fenwick, are you here today, Judy? Oh, Judy came up to me and said, that's by Sargent. And I said, yeah, I know it's by Sargent. I just said Whistler. But it is by Sargent, and this is the one of the woman who's got the ambergris is on this brazier in front of her, and she's inhaling the fumes from it. So if you want to see it, it's at the Clark Institute in Williamstown, and this year they were actually asking people, what's your favorite piece in the museum? Because they wanted to do, they have a website of the 50 favorite pieces, and this is number one. Yes?
We were there on Monday, and they're doing a huge expansion there,
Yeah.
so they have a very limited display right now, 3 rooms. That's one of them, so it's on display right now.
I hope you didn't, on my say-so, tell them that's actually by Yes, Barbara?
What is she actually doing? Why is she inhaling this smoke?
To get high.
Oh,
Yeah. All right, so, I now have to review a little bit of something that I talked about 2 months ago, but if any of you were here 2 months ago, I'm sure you've forgotten it. But I want to talk a little bit about why Americans were out in the Pacific Ocean in the late 18th and early 19th century, because this was part of a big trade. And one of the things that I said 2 months ago, which I want to say again, is that there is very much a sense, I think, for Americans, that the Atlantic world has operated as a sort of trading region for 500 years. And part of it is because the Atlantic world, I'm sorry I don't have my globe here. They cleaned everything up. The Atlantic world is actually, and it's harder to see this on a map than on a globe, but the Atlantic is so much smaller than the Pacific that when, oh yeah, great, Jill is bringing a globe. My lovely assistant will bring it over. So, here is the Atlantic Ocean. This is what the Atlantic Ocean looks like on a globe. Here is the Pacific Ocean. Pacific Ocean is so much vaster that it took about 250 years before Europeans began to send ships into it. And so it was a much later thing, and also because it's so much vaster, we tend not to think of it in the same way as a place that has, you know, here we see the clear margins, we can talk about an Atlantic world trade, but I am here to tell you that there was also very much an interconnected Pacific trade, and it begins with the publications of James Cook. I mean, there had been a couple of other Europeans that had been there, but Cook was a guy that documented voyages to such an extent that the popularity of the South Pacific really began at that time. And so this is a map that actually was drawn by John Webber, who was on Cook's third voyage, an American, and he was one of the guys that, up along the northwest coast, saw that the sea otter pelts that they purchased there from the Indians, when they got across to China, sold for a really high price. This was potentially the answer to the American-China trade, because Americans needed to have some commodity that they could bring to Canton in order to get the China trade started. There wasn't a currency, there wasn't gold coins that were available to be able to trade, and so they were looking for a commodity that could be traded. And sea otter pelts seemed like they were the answer to this for a couple of reasons. One is, you could buy them very cheaply. At that time, Northwest Coast Indians didn't have any metalworking technology, so you could take bars of iron, which they called chisels, you could make them into bullets, into spoons, into knife blades, into arrow points, and all of those things were got very cheaply in the early parts of the trade. And then you bring the pelts over to Canton, where they're worth a tremendous amount of money. So this sort of went up and down, but it underpinned the China trade for about 25 years. In the meantime, they found that there were other products in the Pacific that they could also bring to Canton. So here is the way that the Pacific trade begins to work. The first voyage to China actually went by the Cape of Good Hope in 1784, and it was a voyage of a ship called the Empress of China from New York, and what they brought was ginseng, the root plant, which actually grows wild in forests along the eastern seaboard of North America. So they brought that. They knew the Chinese liked it because they had heard about this from French Jesuit missionaries who had been in China, had seen that they used ginseng in a number of ways. It sort of was a, you know, a pick-me-up, a slight aphrodisiac. It was actually kind of like ambergris. Yeah, it was a cure-all for all kinds of things. And they knew that it came to them from India and from places around China. The French were the first ones to notice that it was growing up in Ontario, and that they could, and around Montreal, they could have it come from there, ship it to Asia, and get money for it. So so much better for the Americans. So Americans sent the first cargo via the Cape of Good Hope. But thereafter, they really began to concentrate on a Pacific trade. So Cape Horn is rounded in 1787 on voyages by the ships Columbia and Washington from Boston, headed up to the northwest coast to get sea otter pelts. They took those to China, and there they exchanged them for tea is the principal commodity, but also porcelain, and also for silk and other products. They went to the Spice Islands of Indonesia, where they got cloves and peppercorns, allspice, mace and nutmeg, and brought them back to the United States. They went to Hawaii. Hawaii had sandalwood, which was another product that was known to be desirable in Canton, and they carried that from Hawaii to Canton on the very first voyage of the Lady Washington. And then there were other Polynesian products as well. That's sandalwood, kind of hard to see, but tortoiseshell, mother of pearl, bêche de mer, which is a kind of edible sea slug. And then they began to carry these things back home. So tortoiseshell gets made into tortoiseshell buttons, brought back out to the Northwest Coast. And this is really my topic of today, is changes in the traditional cultural materials and things that went in and out that were not part of the trade. So that one is making money by getting the sea otter pelt and trading it in Canton and bringing it back for the owners of the ship. But getting souvenirs was a different kind of prospect. And a lot of these guys had very much an idea of documenting their voyage in a certain way, of participating in the science of the age. That this was an age when people were trying to understand the world around them by gathering things into a central location, which in the late 17th century was called a cabinet of curiosities, or a wonder cabinet. And these things, where you try to encapsulate the world in a room, were where certain disciplines of knowledge developed. For one thing, the taxonomic structure of nature was first devised by guys that are looking at collections in museums. But so is the discipline of anthropology, which is looking at what the relationship is between different people in different places. You bring sandalwood and mother of pearl and tortoiseshell to Canton, and then you buy things made out of that same material and bring them back as souvenirs. And finally, some of the things that we think of as being the most representative kinds of objects of certain groups actually were made for a souvenir market to be traded, even as early as the very early part of the 19th century. This last thing is just to show relationship between South America. So this is sort of the Pacific world where there is a web of interconnected trade. So I'm mostly interested in Bostonians, and Bostonians traveling out to the Pacific went mostly on fairly small vessels. This is the New Hazard of Salem. This is, probably 85 feet long. It's not as big as the Siemens or the Kramer. And this is a vessel on which a crew of young men, mostly very young men, sail around the globe. They stop in 6 different places with different languages that they don't speak. They have to negotiate with strangers. They have to be able to get across the point of view. They have to figure out what things are worth, the things that they're carrying, and the things that they want to receive. It's really an interesting period. We know most about it from the logbooks and journals that they have left us. This is from the first voyage of the Columbia and the Washington from Boston out to the Pacific, and then the Columbia went around the world, back again, and in 1792, under the command of Robert Gray, into the Great River of the West, as they were then calling it, and Gray decided to name it after his ship, so the Columbia River is named in that very early voyage. And this is actually a journal from a ship called the Rob Roy that was commanded by a guy named Daniel Cross. It was a voyage from 1822 to 24 to the North Pacific. And it took me a really, really long time to figure out who wrote it, because most pages look something like this. It's a really great journal. It's this thick. And it went to these villages along the coast from the Columbia River, north along what's now British Columbia, and up to Alaska, and to the strait between what's now British Columbia and Russia, and traded in individual villages there, and had a really interesting and complex relationship with local people there. I've actually been working for about 10 years as an expert witness on a lawsuit representing the Haida tribe of British Columbia against Her Majesty the Queen and the Government of Canada. And what they are, the Haida have never surrendered their lands by treaty with the government of Great Britain or Canada. And so now they're looking to assert their right to land ownership. And so what my part of the job was, is to show that at the time the treaty was signed in the 1840s, that defined the boundary between the United States and British Canada, that both signers of the treaty knew that Haida people lived in that archipelago called the Queen Charlotte Islands, or Haida Gwaii. And absolutely they did. And in fact, William Sturgis from Barnstable went to Congress, and he was actually really interesting proponent of not expanding out to the West Coast. He gave a series of lectures in Boston, which actually I have prepared for publication, and the Sturgis Library will be releasing it just in time for you to give it for Christmas. But William Sturgis went down to Congress, and one of the things he said was that, first of all, he didn't see how it was manageable to have a country that went from the Atlantic to the Pacific with the Rocky Mountains in between. That it wasn't a good time for American expansion, that the British were only in it for the Hudson's Bay Company, and that there are already people living out there, and that they're the actual owners of the land, so they ought to just be left to it. And Sturgis was really the only person that said that in all those negotiations, and interestingly enough, of all the people that went to Congress and testified about this, he's the only one that had actually been to the place that they were talking about. So he had a very interesting perspective on this. He was one of the owners of the Rob Roy, and when the Rob Roy came back to Boston, on board was this mask, which Captain Daniel Cross had collected at some point between 1822 and 1824. So very early. This has been, he gave it immediately to the Museum of the East India Marine Society in Salem, which is now the Peabody Essex Museum. And, whoops, you know what I did? I stepped on the cord, which I was swearing I wasn't going to do. And so there's a really interesting thing about that. What is it about this mask that made Daniel Cross want to collect it? Any thoughts? Can you tell that it's a face of a woman and that her lip is distended with a wooden plug called a levret, and a pretty big one? So this was a practice on the Northwest Coast, especially in Haida Gwaii, among the Haida people and among Tlingit, where high-ranking women had this incision made at puberty that was like with a copper nail, and then it would begin to deteriorate, and your lip would get a sore there, and eventually it grew big enough to put in a small plug, and then over the years you get a bigger and bigger one until, really high-ranking elderly women had some that were like 2 inches across from one side to the other. And sailors were interested in this. There is no sailor that went to that region that kept a journal that did not write in it a description of the wearing of levrets and some sense of either awe or repulsion. They didn't like them, they didn't think they were attractive, but there's nobody who didn't talk about them. So on board the Rob Roy, there was a Haida chief named Nakut, or Niakut, spelled different ways, who actually came on board a number of American ships and stayed for a couple of months. He operated his own trade. I mean, he traded over the side with things that he had brought with him. With other Indian groups, he traded one kind of hat for another kind of hat. He was a pilot. He knew people. He spoke some English. So he lived on the ship for a long time. So my theory is that at some point, the interest in levrets puts him in a position to make a gift to Captain Cross of this mask. And so this mask might have been one that was made for traditional use in a winter ceremonial, but we don't know. What else is collected by these guys? This is an argillite pipe made out of a kind of slate that's only found in Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte Islands. And Haida people, now, argillite carving is one of the great art forms, but you don't find it in archaeological sites. And so it seems that it might have started to be carved for the first time in the early part of the 19th century. And so the first examples that we have of it, they're not traditional Haida designs. They're things like this. This is a ship that's clearly an American or a European ship, and it's carved out of argillite. And it was acquired by a guy named John Coffin Jones, who was the American consul in Hawaii. So all these ships going to and from the Northwest Coast stopped in Hawaii. So somebody gave him this thing that had been made by the Haida. Yeah?
What did you call that material?
Argillite.
What is that?
It's a kind of slate. It's a black slate, yeah. But this particular version of it only occurs in one seam in the Queen Charlotte Islands. Nobody knows of any other place to get it. So when you see these carvings, they're always Haida. I mean, it's a Haida thing. And in fact, I was out at a conference in Vancouver just a couple of weeks ago and heard somebody talking about, as a child, having been brought to this place by his grandfather. And it's such a climb to get up to the top that you can only carry out, a few chunks of it. So it's not like you can easily go and mine it, and there's no public access up to it at all. But the art form as we know it begins in souvenirs that are made for outsiders. And here's another kind of object. This is a hat that was made at Nootka Sound, and it's a hat that's worn by a whaling chief. And you can see it's got a whaling scene on it. Here's a whale, and here's a boat and a guy with a harpoon, and there's a line attached. And these were something that Captain Cook had seen, John Webber had drawn pictures of them, and so every ship that went to the Northwest Coast wanted to get one of these. And in a moment I'm going to tell you an interesting story about some of these that were actually collected by Lewis and Clark and brought back for museums in the East. Okay, so here's that mask again by Daniel Cross. When I first started to look at these things, about 30 years ago, I worked at the Peabody Essex Museum, and I'm from the Northwest, so when I went around a corner one day and saw this mask at eye level, it just stopped me in my tracks. You know, how did you get to Salem, especially at such an early time? And it was a question that actually propelled me through a doctoral dissertation looking at things that were collected by outsiders. And this is the most stunning thing. In the 30 years since then, this is how many of those masks I've found. The interesting thing is, they're all carved by the same guy, and they're all depicting the same woman. So at this point, we have now something that is not being made for traditional use, but actually being made as a souvenir. So that once high people saw that outsiders were interested in this cultural artifact, they made a bunch of them, and these masks were actually in circulation from the 1820s. The earliest evidence that we have is Daniel Cross collecting the one that's up there at the top left. And then the rest of them were collected over a period of 40 years and over a stretch of coastline almost 600 miles long. So that this one right here, let's see, this one up, the second one from the right on the top, oh, actually, I'll use my harpoon. This one was collected by the Wilkes expedition in the Columbia River in the 1840s. So there is a long period. This, I couldn't believe it when I found this one. I teach a course on the history of museums at Harvard, and I am very interested in P.T. Barnum and the museum that he had in New York in the 1830s and 40s. And it burned down, unfortunately, in the 1860s. But he published a catalog in 1850, and this mask is in it. It said it was a mask of a Sandwich Islander. And you can see that it's actually got this same design here on the left side of the nose, and stripes, which are similar to some of these, that the artist who did the sketch of it didn't really know what he was looking at, but there's no doubt that this is one probably destroyed in that fire, unfortunately. But look at this. Here are now 8 masks made by the same hand, and this one here, all of these are, you know, the size that you could take it and put it on your face, until you get to that one, which was actually donated to the Peabody Museum at Harvard by William Sturgis's grandson. William Sturgis Bigelow is only this big, and the eye holes have not been cut out, and it's not nearly as finely carved, but it's still carved by the same guy. At that point, he has ceased even to try to make it look like a mask that would have been used in any kind of ceremonial. Now it is strictly a souvenir. And that's an interesting thing to see. Yeah?
How do you know it's something by the same artist?
Well, you know, I mean, if you look at them, there are certain characteristics about the way they're carved, but, you know, I didn't really trust myself in just my eye at this, so I've actually taken high-quality photos of these, and I have shown them to Bill Holm, who is now retired from the University of Washington, but in the 60s he wrote a really influential book called Northwest Coast Indian Art, An Analysis of Form, and a lot of the artists who have been trained since then have really been trained with his book. So he's the guy that more than any other has looked at you know, art along the coast. He knew most of these masks, but we talked about this, and then I'm going to show you another series. And he agreed that in fact they're all carved by the same hand. And then last year I met with Robert Davidson, who is the great Haida artist, a really magnificent artist. And I was going to go meet him up in Vancouver, and I got up to the border and I forgot my passport. Damn, we need a passport to go to Canada now. So I called him. I really felt bad. He lives just across the border, so he said, well, he'll walk across the border. And we went out to a Mexican restaurant. It was great. But we were looking at all these pictures, and he was, you know, looking at the manner in which the grain is used, and the way that they're carved and the way that they're painted. He had no question but that these were all done by the same artist. Even the littler one, which is not as finely carved. I mean, it's not as thin. It wasn't worked to the same extent. The other thing that's interesting is that the 4 bottom things that you see are dolls, and their dolls are about this tall, full-figured dolls. One of them is squatting, but the rest are all, standing upright. You have, arms and legs. And these are not dolls of the woman who is depicted there. These dolls are all wearing a mask. They're all carved to show that, in fact, you can see the edge of the mask around. I don't know why I think that's so cool, but I do. That there's something about the mask that was important here. And then after, finding all of these, there were other masks which were attributed to this series, which now, sort of taking this to the next step, I think that, in fact, this group is not by the same artist, though clearly they were influenced by them. This one is the most interesting. This one is at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was collected by George Catlin from William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he actually, I'll tell you the difference about doing research now and doing research 30 years ago. When I found that this was at the University of Pennsylvania, I sent a note to the curator down there, and he sent me back a note and said that Catlin had done a sketch of it and it appeared in his 1860 book, Manners and Customs of the American Indians. And I actually went online to the Harvard Library System, and that book has been digitized, and I could actually, within 5 minutes, find the image in the book, cut it out and look at it. But this one, things begin to change here. For one thing, the ears are entirely different on these. The shape of the mouth is different. A couple of them don't have librets. 2 of them don't have librets. But the rest of them, the libret is much squarer. The eyebrows come to a point. So just to give you a picture of the difference, these all have either really flat ears that lie, flush with the surface of the mask, or they have no ears at all. But these all have these sort of B or backward V-shaped ears. So even though the person who did these clearly knew about the first set, this is somebody else. So here we have a kind of souvenir item which is really being produced to be sold, again, by the middle of the 19th century to a group of outsiders. Any questions on those? Well, I have these slides up because I'm going to move on from them, but I could talk about them all day, so I think you probably are beginning to understand. So other kinds of very traditional things that were collected. This was actually collected by Robert Bennett Forbes, who was a Boston China trader, and he never went to the Northwest Coast. This is a very traditional kind of dancing robe, they're called. They're sometimes called chilkat blankets or raven robes, and you wear them around your shoulders, and they display your crest. And you can see that the really old ones have wear here at the places where they've been bent. They're made of a warp of twisted cedar bark and a weft of mountain goat wool. So they're really a tremendous thing. And this one shows 2 coppers on it. What these are they're an artifact which has no usefulness other than to display your wealth. They were made from hammered copper, and these were produced at a potlatch, which was a ceremony in the wintertime where you had a ritual distribution of gifts. And this was one of the ways that one group in a village would pay off another group for having built them a house, for having erected a pole, for having done a naming ceremony for a child, or a funeral for somebody who had died. And there were different groups in the village that had relationships where they performed these services for the other. And the way that they got paid for them was through this distribution of gifts. And so this is a blanket that would have been extremely valuable for showing these coppers on it. Some coppers, by the way, were actually, somebody would get them at a potlatch, and then the following year, they would break it into 2 pieces or 4 pieces, and they would give away the pieces at the next potlatch, which was a way of showing, I have so much power and prestige that I can break this thing up. And then, the next couple of years, guys would be working to try to reassemble the parts. And now, so some of the most valuable coppers are ones that you can see where they've been welded together. Pieces have been welded together. And when anthropologists arrived on the Northwest Coast in the 1870s and offered to buy some of these things, and they were told this copper is worth 100,000 blankets. They couldn't understand it. How could this thing have such value? But the value of it was embedded in the number of times and the process through which it had been distributed around the group, each time sort of representing the wealth that was distributed there. So, Robert Bennett Forbes, these are made by the Tlingit of Chilkat, Alaska, and they're usually, so sometimes they're called Chilkat blankets. Robert Bennett Forbes got this in California, probably from a Tlingit hunter who had gone down on an American ship to hunt sea otter pelts on the coast of California when the sea otter pelts were decimated on the Northwest Coast. in cahoots with the Russians, Americans used to bring gangs of Northwest Coast Indian or Alutiiq or Kodiak hunters from Alaska down to the coast of California for them to hunt the sea otters and then bring them back home before they went on to China. So Robert Bennett Forbes got this great thing at this distance. And again, it's part of just looking at the Pacific as a world of trade, a place where ships are going up and down along the coast, back and forth between islands and continents, and material goods are always in motion. Here's the kind of blanket that replaced the Chilkat blanket, which was a very difficult thing to make. This is also difficult, but not as difficult to make. But by the 1880s, when anthropologists were arriving on the Northwest Coast, when photographs began to be taken, many people are actually wearing crest images of all trade materials. So this is made out of blue and red woolen blankets, probably acquired through the Hudson's Bay Company. And these are mother-of-pearl shells that are appliqued on here. Those are shells that are brought in by American merchants. And it still shows the crest image. In this case, it's got an eagle here in the middle, but it's also got, these are the coppers that are again shown on this. So again, just this symbol of the wealth. But the trade itself began to dramatically alter the art of the Northwest Coast Indians. For one thing, at the time that Americans first arrived there, and right after Cook. So when Cook arrived, he went from Hawaii up to the Northwest Coast, and the artist that traveled with him, John Weber, who was a terrific artist, Weber did a number of drawings of interiors of houses, and the house posts that held up the roof beams were always carved, elaborately carved. But there were no freestanding totem poles that were described at that time in any of the places to which Cook went. Within 100 years, totem poles were being described all over the place. And the reason for that is that it's really hard to carve a totem pole if you don't actually have a knife with a metal blade. And so the introduction of metal tools completely revolutionized art on the Northwest Coast. And there was a huge fluorescence of the carving arts in totem poles and in carved house, what do we call those things? No, it's these big, made out of boards. This is my, no, it's a wall. It's a wall. It's a carved wall. It has an actual name, but that's what it is. And sometimes they have a hole in them. There'll be like figures that are painted on it, and one has a gigantic mouth, and there's a hole carved, and it stands at the back of the house, and you can actually come in through it in the course of certain ceremonial things. Yeah?
If they didn't have knives, how did they carve those masks?
The masks were carved with, tools that were made out of sharpened shell or sharpened stone of different kinds. There are several different kinds of flaky stones there that you could make into a pretty sharp thing. But the fluorescence into the gigantic stuff really happened as a result of the introduction of these new tools. And also that those masks, I should have pointed this out, that here actually is a wonderful painted house front. But the masks...
You're talking about a facade?
No, actually there's a screen. They're called screens. Yeah, house screens. In this mask, this is the Daniel Cross mask again. And actually, that's not the best picture of it. The colors here are not quite so true. But the red paint that's on all of these, the lip and everything else, this red paint is Chinese vermilion paint. Originally they would have used a red that was made from iron, rust, but this great pigment, as soon as it started to be introduced to the Northwest Coast, boy, it revolutionized everything. So by the 1810s, the Haida and others were using this great paint. Yeah, I meant house screens, which divide one part of the house from the other. Okay, so on the Northwest Coast, Bostonians arrive and their influence is palpable. Look at this great house here. This one you see says cheap. That's where you can buy good products cheap. But this one actually says Boston. He is the head chief of Nauwit. He is true and honest and don't give no trouble to no white man. So they know who their market is. They know who they are looking to appease. And so the idea of creating these objects that will go back as souvenirs as well as trade items really becomes part of the way people are looking at things. And stuff goes back and forth both ways in the Pacific. This is at Chilkoot, Alaska in the 1870s. And these boxes here are Chinese boxes. They're made out of camphor wood, they're covered with pigskin, and they're painted. I actually have one. My husband gave me one when I got my PhD that had gone from China to the Northwest Coast and had been in a quadrupedal family for 100 years. Here's the image of the house of Chief Shakes in Wrangell, Alaska around 1909. And so here are some of the traditional carved house posts that you see, and things that are painted on canvas, probably things brought from ships, probably extra sails. But there's also a lot of stuff here from China. These boxes are all beginning to replace the traditional bentwood boxes, which had been part of the culture. These are other Chinese. These are brass-bound camphorwood Chinese chests, and you see, a rattan furniture and a guitar. So this sort of mishmash of Western stuff and imported stuff, or imported stuff and traditional stuff becomes the way that people are living their lives. And we see, and this is my last image from the Northwest Coast, but this was taken by Edward Sheriff Curtis in 1911 in the Columbia River. These are Wishram women who are part of the tribal groups that are down on the south bank of the Columbia. And these women they're both wearing the same cap. It's a wedding cap, and it's made out of different kinds of shells, but can you see that at the bottom of each little loop is a Chinese coin that's tied onto it. So again, things that come across the Atlantic or come from American traders were very quickly incorporated into traditional ways of life. So as the culture changes, which it changes immediately upon contact, collectors are bringing back things which will document traditional culture in a really interesting way. This happened around the South Pacific as well. So this is from David Porter's Journal of a Cruise made to the Pacific Ocean, which was published in 1815. Porter was in the South Pacific in part to protect American whale ships from incursions by the British during the War of 1812. He ended up being captured in Valparaiso Harbor, but he spent a fairly substantial period of time in the Marquesas Islands. And in the Marquesas, he was quick to try to suss out what the political affiliations were of different groups, and then to work one group against another. But he kept a very detailed journal, and he left tremendous descriptions of the landscape and of places, of things that people wore, activities, built a fort there, which you can still see the location in Nukuhiva, and he wrote about things that people wore and things that they carried, and there were artists on board who did these wonderful illustrations. So this is one of the chiefs at Taiwai, which is the main harbor that you come into as you sail into Nukuhiva. And he's carrying a staff, a great staff called an u'u, apostrophe U. And all of these things that he is wearing, there's sort of a little side view. It's very likely that Porter collected some of these things, but unfortunately, when he went back to Valparaiso, he was defeated by the British, lost his ship, and I haven't been able to locate any of the collections that he might have made in any museum, which is unfortunate. But here is, so here's a nice sort of close-up of what the u'u club looks like. This is a sperm whale. These two things are sperm whale ear ornaments, and you can see that this guy is wearing the top one here. It shows this necklace that he's wearing is here, the shell that he's carrying, this whale's tooth around the neck is there as well. Porter actually made a claim in his journal that whale's teeth were worth so much to Marquesans that if an American ship could get there, a couple of big whale's teeth would get you $1 million worth of sandalwood to trade in Canton, and the Marquesans would cut it, carry it down to the boats, pack it on the boats for you. This turned out to be a wild exaggeration. A couple of ships set out there right away to try to take advantage of that, including Sam Hill, who I talked about a couple of months ago. But you can see that there is, at this time, this is the first American visit to the Marquesas, and a lot will follow, especially among whale ships. But there's an intense interest in the material culture and in documenting it. Yeah?
That shell looks just like something from the Caribbean.
It does, these big, and I'm sorry I'm not a shell expert, but those big, yeah, Triton kind of things, yeah. Anybody want to say anything more about that, who's actually an expert on shells? I'm always hesitant here in this room because there's always experts on some other stuff. And shells is likely to be one of them.
There was a guy that tried to trace sailor-made artifacts, including sailors' valentines, by documenting what the species of the shells were, and you could tell where they were made, and found that the temperate band and subtropical band around the world, all the shells are either identical species or so close you can't tell the difference, so he failed to compare it.
Yeah, but I certainly have seen these big shells like this in the Caribbean as well as in the South Pacific. But boy, on Christmas Island, for instance, these are just lying not only on the beach, but you know, it's a big coral atoll. Walking down the street, you see these big shells sort of strewn around. So yes, they are everywhere. All right, the material culture of Marquesans, along with their tattoos, was a very interesting thing. And so you know, we get images, several images like this. This is, you know, I mean, this is not exactly like Porter's, but you can see how similar it is in so many ways. And the guy is also carrying an uwu. And I have actually just started on a project, which will probably take the next 10 or 20 years. But I would actually like to try to put together a global census of uwus in museum collections around the world. So that this is from sometime before 1850, say. And there's probably 1,000 of them, and there are lots of different kinds of museums. But they show the distribution, the global distribution of a kind of artifact from a really remote location in the center of the Pacific. And there's a lot of things about it that intrigue me. And as I mentioned early on, in the Marquesas today, there's not a single one of these that's left. There are 10 of them at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. There's 10 of them at the Peabody Essex Museum that were collected probably before 1820. There are dozens of museums. The British Museum's got 20 of them. So they've gone all over the world. Yeah.
Are they a warriors club? Or do they know that?
You know, it's not.
Doesn't look like tourism.
I know. This one is not. This is not made for. In fact, one of the things that's interesting about this is that after about 1850. There's a period in there, somewhere in there, when they stopped being made at all. And then there's a period when they're sort of made again, but they don't look anything like the old ones. And then they've never really recovered. So they all left. That was one of the things, that all the clubs left the islands and none were left. And again, here in the Marquesas, tremendous loss of population due to disease. Herman Melville was in Nukuhiva in 1841. And at that time, he described the Typee Valley. There were some 3,500 people living there. Within 30 years, the population had dropped to 300. So, you know, again, just a tremendous population loss. People stopped making these. They're all gone. And then, you know, how do you recover it? So that's one of the things I'm interested in. But these, I don't think were made for souvenirs. I think people got the ones that actually were made for use. And what they used them for ain't clear. I mean, it's they are always in this kind of image associated with someone of very high rank. So it's clearly an emblem of rank, among other things. Whether it was actually ever used as a weapon or not, nobody has documented. Though they're called war clubs in a lot of the literature. They're really heavy, and you could do some serious damage to someone if you hit them with it. Paul Mohono-Niva, who's the Tahitian archaeologist that works with us on our Sustainability in Polynesian Island Cultures and Ecosystems class at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, actually picked one up and swung it around his head. Oh my God. I'm a museum person, so.
Is it tropical wood? Or
It is. It's a native wood, and it's called ironwood there, but it's not the same as lignum vitae that's called ironwood in other places, but it's very heavy. Anyway, they're extremely elaborately carved, and they're all different. One of the things that I hope to do as we get better images of all these is to start to use art historical principles to compare them and see whether or not you can say, okay, these three are by the same man, and looking over time what the changes are and whether or not they're representing individual families. Yeah, sure.
The frazzly things at the bottom end here, those just frazzled parts of a binding that comes?
Yes, this is actually little feathers that are stuck into this binding. This one is in extraordinarily good condition. Most of them, the binding is gone. I mean, the vast majority of them in museum collections. But anyway, so this is a project that I'm working on. Yeah?
I'm just curious if any have potentially been dated to see if they were maybe passed down or if they were created during the 17th century, or 19th century, sorry.
You know, I've already collected photographs of about 100 of these. And in Nukuhiva last year, when I was there on the Siemens, we met with a group of carvers, and we actually looked at all these and said, can you tell us what any of these things mean? And we're interested in, there's a little thing here that I will call the collar that has designs in it that are, you know, for lack of a better word, they're sort of hieroglyphic. And Jan Whitting, one of the scientists who works with me, is designing a computer program that can sort of look at elements of this and see which ones appear in which clubs. And some of these can be associated with design elements that you see in tattoos. And in the 19th century, there were a number of outsiders, European and French and English guys, that tried to do a sort of catalog of tattoo images and say what they meant. But unfortunately, asking these guys in the Marquesas, you know, what do these things mean? They don't know. And they don't know whether or not these were things that were handed down by, you know, fathers to sons, for instance, because they never, you know, they were gone before they lived. Also, they were given away easily enough that I'm a little bit hesitant in thinking that they had that sort of family lore attached to the farmer.
Well, they sort of look like something that, say, the British Empire, you sit on the throne with your scepter.
They do look like that, don't they?
Scepter.
Yeah.
And did they have rituals in their society that where they would sit and review people or things or religions?
I've never seen such an image or description of that. Certainly the pictures of them, all the pictures that I know of them, and there are about a dozen of these, they're all standing when they're holding it. And they're holding it in different positions. I mean, you can see that just between this one and the one in Porter. So don't know about that. And there's more than one guy in a village group that has one. So it's not strictly the scepter of, you know, highest rank. Rick, did you have a question?
I had a similar thought, that a scepter or a mayor's mace.
Yeah.
Are there any things that may appear to be antecedents to this, where you could see that this evolved as a symbolic representation of something that was once a practical item, a club, or?
From the earliest period that we know of contact with Marquesans, these clubs have existed.
Okay.
So, and in archaeological sites, I don't know of anything. But I'm just at the start of my project. All right, so
What's the other thing he's carrying?
it's a gourd that is in a sort of, you know, carrier that's made out of some kind of probably coconut fiber or some other fiber. I don't know what's in it. Okay, so other things that began to be collected in the Pacific, where the outsider influence is also very apparent when you look at it. This is lei Neopalaoa, which is this is a symbol of rank worn by Hawaiians, and it's made out of tiny little strands of human hair. And when Cook arrived there, Cook was the first European to arrive at the Hawaiian Islands. At that time, it was clear that small hooks made out of different kinds of materials were really important on these. But the mana that it represents, which comes from your head, both your hair, but also something that would be made out of a tooth, were really powerful to Hawaiians. And so, as American whalemen began to come in with whale's teeth, sperm whale teeth made out of ivory, they quickly began to be sort of the most representative thing that you would see here, this hook on the necklace made out of sperm whale ivory. But Hawaiians also got onto ships and traveled up to the Arctic, and so we see numbers of them that are made out of walrus ivory as well. So sperm whale ivory, walrus ivory, and even a couple of them are made out of elephant ivory, which would have been brought in by American China traders stopping in Hawaii. And so these are a very important thing. Again, since Cook arrived there, these have been highly sought after by collectors, and we see them in lots of different collections. Going in and coming out of something also, we see a lot of these Fijian tambua, they're called, which are made out of a sperm whale tooth. Usually it has some sort of writing, though it doesn't really mean anything. And even Fijians ask about this, say that there's not a real meaning to the writing. You can see here is some of this again too. But sperm whale teeth were both brought into Fiji, made into these things, and then the things themselves, the tambua, became a very popular form of souvenir for people to bring out of Fiji. This is my favorite one of all time. Here's one that in the 1830s was made into scrimshaw by some sailor who
William Sizer.
William Sizer, who actually, my husband Stuart Frank is the curator, is the senior curator at the Medford Whaling Museum, actually has inspired me in a lot of thinking about this by looking at Scrimshaw, not as just an anonymous folk art, but trying to say how many hands are involved in making this. And so he actually has created bodies of work by individual guys. So this is made by a known scrimshander, William Sizer. It gets sold to a Fijian guy who puts some writing on it and drills the holes up here at the top and at the bottom so that he can wear it across his chest as a sign of rank. And then later it's given to the Honorable W.S. Carew, who is the British guy that's in charge of the colonial government in Fiji, who gives it to another guy who gives it to the East India Marine Society, now the Peabody Essex Museum. So there is a piece that's got this fabulous history that's right on it, all of the hands through which it passed in its journey around the Pacific. So now I'm just going to give you one little interesting story of hats. And this is attached to Sandhill too. So this is, so Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark off across the country, the continent in 1804, and told Lewis and Clark when they arrived at the Pacific Ocean, they should send a couple of their trusty people back by sea with their notes, and all of them come back if they thought that it was too dangerous. So William Clark talks about reaching the Columbia River, took over 2 canoes of Indians going down to trade. One of them spoke a few words of English, said their principal man who traded with them was Mr. Haley, who has a woman in his canoe, and it was fun. Showed us a bow of iron and several other things which he said Mr. Haley gave him. So Mr. Haley is actually Sandhill. I spoke about him 2 months ago. This is where they are, down here in the Columbia River. And John Jewett had been a captive of the Indians at Nootka Sound for a couple of years. In 1802, his ship, the Boston, was captured, and he was rescued by Sam Hill. So Sam Hill was the first American to be at Nootka Sound in about 2 years, and he's got stuff on board the ship. And Lewis and Clark begin, just after Sam Hill leaves the place, to talk about having gotten some hats from the Indians that look like this. They have this little knob on the top, and they actually describe that the images on them are of representations of whales, canoes, harpooners striking them. And then they collected 2 of them, and they brought them back, and they gave them to Thomas Jefferson, who gave them to Charles Wilson Peale, who later sold them to the Boston Museum, who later gave them to the Peabody Museum at Harvard. And here they are today. So these 2 hats, carried down the coast by Sam Hill, collected by Lewis and Clark, brought across the whole continent. I mean, it's a really astonishing collection. That Lewis and Clark bought other hats from women who lived at the Chinook women who lived in the Columbia River. They bought hats which they described as hats that they wanted to wear. They were really good waterproof hats. But these are hats that they collected as souvenirs, and they kept them separate. And somehow, and I don't know how, they kept them in perfect condition. These are actually, I mean, they're sturdy, but those knobs have come off the tops of lots of their museum collections, and the fact that they got them all the way across the continent is really amazing. They collected a couple of others too, including a top hat woven by a Tlingit Indian, and one made in the style of a sailor hat. So all these things, actually this is outside no more, but so these are 4 hats collected by Lewis and Clark at the Columbia River, none of which originated in the Columbia River. They all came from somewhere else and brought back across the continent. So the collecting of souvenirs was an important enough thing that people really dedicated some time and effort to it. What's happened out there in the world of all these things? Sea otters, sadly, endangered. Tortoises endangered. Sandalwood endangered. So that this did not come at no cost. But we can still see a lot of these things as we travel out there. This is the Robert C. Siemens in Haida Gwaii. This is at Skangwai village on the Anthony Island, the southernmost island of the Queen Charlotte chain. And this is Robert C. Siemens in Nukuhiva Harbor in the Marquesas. So the ship has made a lot of play, but I want to close by talking about something that happened when I was there in 2011. Because it says something about the way that these cultural items can be obtained. And I think that one of the things that really struck me about Polynesians all through the whole of the Polynesian archipelago is that there is such a generosity of spirit that you have to be careful that you don't admire anything, because people will take it right off and hand it to you. They will give you, and so students would always come back to the ship laden down with bunches of bananas, with baskets of mangoes, with that great green grapefruit pamplemousse, which is so sweet and wonderful. But we were on the, this is at Taiwan Bay, actually, where the village site is, and we went in, and actually it's a lot greener when you get ashore. And we met this guy who gave us this ads, and this ads is actually hanging on the wall out in the lounge. So I want you to take a look at it, because it is the modern manifestation of the sailor collecting the souvenir item. Students were walking down the beach. They wanted to go into an outrigger canoe, and they found some guys that took them sailing. And when they came back, these guys had started to make lunch with fish and with breadfruit and things that they were cooking on the fire. And this guy came along, his name is Fada, and he says, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" And our Tahitian archaeologist who's on our faculty was explaining to him in Marquesan who we were, and the guy went home and he came back. He is a carver, and this is the ads he was working on, and he just gave it to us. Gave it to us just because he thought what we were doing is cool. And I think that in fact, that is what happened to so many of these u'u. You know, it's the reason why so many of them left, is because it's the kind of thing that one's likely to have in a canoe, and if you are swapping things and people like you, the gift giving begins, and these cultural items were one of the things that went along with it. So this was part of our SPICE class, Sustainability in Polynesian Island Cultures and Ecosystems. We will run another one that starts in January, and if you're interested in knowing more about that, next month, at this very time, in this very room, I'm actually going to talk about a voyage from Tahiti to Hawaii via the Tuamotus, the Marquesas, Christmas Island in Kiribati, and then Hawaii with a group of students from SEA, and thinking about these issues of sustainability. And so our class, Sustainability in Polynesian Island Cultures and Ecosystems, looks at cultural adaptation and change over time, and as a result of the introduction of new materials, loss of population, new ideas coming in, conversion, colonialism, all those things have a big impact on it. And we have learned a lot in the last 4 years of running this class about life on islands. And so it's what I'll speak about next week. So in closing, there's a book associated with all this. Oh my gosh, yeah. I'm not giving them away, I'm sorry to say. I'm giving away books for the first week, the first lecture. But I have 4 of them if you'd like to take a look at it. This is documenting the Northwest Coast trade. And the next project then is the global census of the u'u diaspora. So if you come across one in a museum and you see it somewhere, there's actually 2 on exhibit right now at the MFA, for instance. I already know about those ones. But if you see them somewhere, send me a note. I would love to know where they are, because some of them, end up in collections where they're difficult to locate. I mean, some places have big Polynesian collections, to look there, but others, it's a lot harder. But there is a really interesting story to be told in the movement of objects around the globe. So, thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, what were some of the trade relationships, we started getting right here with fur, but between the Haida and the British and Americans?
The British actually very quickly got out of the trade because the sea otter counts were bound to Canton, and they couldn't, because of the way that these monopolies were set up, the British East India Company, the British South Seas Company, they couldn't sail things to Canton. So for the British, the biggest presence was the Hudson's Bay Company, which was coming from the east across Canada, and it was the company had such a monopoly that there weren't a lot of other traders that were involved among British. Among Americans, there were a lot. There were at least 200 voyages that were made to the Northwest Coast between 1787, when the Columbia and the Washington went there, and 1840, when the Sea Otter population collapsed and couldn't sustain it anymore. And unfortunately, a lot of the exchanges descended into violence. And you know, it's an interesting thing because there's a long memory among the Haida of some of these. They still remember John Kendrick on that first voyage, taking the Captain Koya as a hostage and cutting his hair, and he lost his status after that. It's a, you know, so some of these things still resonate 200 years later, and not in a good way. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming today. This is the second month in a row that I inadvertently scheduled this in the middle of a 3-day weekend. So I really appreciate that you came out. And the next one is, oh, I should go back one, 2 times. The next one is December 8th, and that one I'm going to talk about the SEA program. Lucy Nelson actually is selling some of the SEA products. If you need something with an SEA logo on it for Christmas, now's the time to start thinking about it. She also has copies of, Stuart and I did an album of pirate songs several years ago with a couple of friends. It's rated R. And if you're looking for other music, I'll just shield here too that the Falmouth Chamber Players Orchestra is doing a concert next Friday night and Sunday afternoon. And I play in the orchestra. Lots of SEA people actually play in the orchestra, interestingly enough. And I think that it's probably the community orchestra with the largest number of PhDs. A lot of people that play, play instruments and play in the orchestra. But we're doing Haydn's 104th Symphony. It's such a great piece. It's at Falmouth Academy, and Falmouth Academy. One of these is on the table there too, but I'll give out a couple of them.
Did you get one to the Enterprise?
They actually do give them to the Enterprise, yes. Anyway, here's the thing. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your interest in coming. And have a nice day.